Labour has let you down and the Tories are toast. That's the message from Reform UK leader Nigel Farage, and their public appear to be listening. The one-time right-wing fringe party has surged in the polls. But can Reform really replace the Conservative opposition? And how much of its success is down to Labour's failure? It's up for debate here on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Yousaf. Nigel Farage has never shied away from a headline, but these recent comments could be amongst his boldest.
We now are the opposition party in the United Kingdom to the Labour Party, and the Tories, frankly, are a waste of space. They are toast. You're witnessing the end of a party that's been around since 1832. It's disappearing.
There's no doubt Reform is on a roll. In recent local elections, it picked up 10 councils and 2 mayoral positions. And it's polling ahead of Labour and the SNP in upcoming Scottish by-elections. But the next general election is still 4 years away. Is it too soon to claim it's dethroned the Conservative opposition and shattered the UK's historical two-party system? Well, it must be doing something right, though. In a bid to turn around some appalling polling numbers, the Labour government has been cannibalising some of Reform's anti-immigration rhetoric.
Every area of the immigration system, work, family and study, will be tightened up so we have more control. But I want to be very clear on this. If we do need to take further steps, if we do need to do more to release pressure on housing and our public services, then mark my words, we will.
On today's Counterpoints debate, we'll ask, what's behind Reform's recent surge? Is immigration really to blame for the UK's economic woes? And how much of Reform's success is down to Labour's failure? Stay with us. Well, to discuss the incredible shift in the British political landscape, I'm joined by Humza, Yousaf, the former Scottish First Minister and current SNP member for the Scottish Parliament, and Matt Goodwin, a professor of politics who writes for his Matt Goodwin Substack. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here on Counterpoints. It's been just 10 months since Labour swept into power with a 174-seat majority in the House of Commons. You wouldn't know it, though, when you look at the current polls. I mean, it's quite astounding when you see that Reform Party is the top choice for many prospective voters on the current YouGov website. Nigel Farage's party won the largest vote share in local elections at the beginning of May. And the man who led the Brexit campaign is now en route to cause another huge political upset. So, Humza, let me ask you first. Why do you think we are seeing this surge in support for Reform UK?
Well, I think there's probably a few reasons for it. First and foremost, this is not happening in a vacuum. You've had at least 20 years of normalising rhetoric that was only ever really only heard by those in the hard right. So you would hear anti-immigration rhetoric from those in the fringes, and those now in power in Westminster over successive governments, be they Tory or Labour, have adopted language like British jobs for British workers, stop the boats, island of strangers. And therefore, normalising that rhetoric, I think, gives legitimacy to that rhetoric. What's also happened, and is significant, is over that 20 years, to use a Scottish word, people feel scunnered. They feel fed up, exasperated, because their living standards have dropped, had the biggest drop in living standards since records began, when the Conservatives were in. And then Labour swept in with a promise of change, only to take money off pensioners, money off the disabled, and betray the WASPy women of pensionable age, who were promised compensation when Labour got in, but not given it. So you have these twin issues going on, where legitimacy of the language over the last 2 decades, a complete failure by political parties in Westminster to offer a hopeful alternative. And of course, populism thrives at a time of economic hardship, and it thrives on dividing the population into us versus them. And I'm afraid the them is now migrants. And we are seeing a rapid rise in reform, to the point where virtually every single opinion poll in the last 6 months would tell you that if there's a general election tomorrow, Reform would be the largest party, which is deeply worrying, in my opinion.
Matthew, what do you make of Humza's assessment there? Is it just that the rhetoric has been normalised, or do you think people are identifying with their policies?
Well, no, I completely disagree with what we've just heard, which is the view that it's illegitimate to worry about very real world historic shifts that are reshaping the country. It's not the rhetoric or language of politicians that are driving support for reform. It's the very real, very deliberate policy backed by the UK state, backed by almost all of the mainstream parties, to impose mass uncontrolled immigration on the country, to lose control of our borders, to have 160,000 illegal migrants and asylum seekers enter Britain while breaking our laws, costing UK taxpayers upwards of £7 billion a year. Now, yes, economic insecurity and anxiety is part of that story, but it is entirely legitimate. It is entirely justified for the British people to say, we are not going to allow our politicians to impose what is an extreme experiment supported by only 10 to 15% of people in Britain, to allow millions of people to migrate into the country, more than 80% of whom are coming from outside of Europe, with no serious plan for how we're going to integrate these people, for how we're going to support our national economy, and how we're going to continue to maintain our public services. That is why people are voting reform, because the establishment has imposed on them this project which nobody voted for.
Humza, what do you make of that? Is immigration at the heart of everyone's concerns here, or is this just a scapegoat issue that Reform knows is popular with a certain segment, and it also gets headlines in the media?
Well, let's first of all, I think, try to deal with the issue and the notion that Nigel Farage is somehow anti-establishment. The man is a multi-millionaire. He is as part of the establishment as you can get. And let's also not play fast and loose with figures, although Matt has done that in the past when he's falsely claimed that 50% of social housing in London goes to those who are not British. It was found to be 14%. Let's stick to some of the facts.
48%.
Let's look at the
48%.
No, 14%. You were proven wrong by Mehdi Hassan, actually.
48% of social housing in London. 48%.
And of course, only 14% was the figure, of course, of social housing that went to those who are not British. But let's deal with some actual facts on the ground. By 2050, the UK will have a dependency ratio of 1 in 4 people over 65. That means we are going to have, and we have, a huge working age demographic time bomb. We also know that by 2050, in both the UK and the European Union, that they will need approximately 45 million workers to sustain our public services. So far from being a burden on our public services and our social services, migrants, whether they're the 30% who are not British who make up junior doctors in England, whether they're those who are in social care, or indeed in the private sector who are working in our hospitality and retail sector, this country needs migration, not uncontrolled migration, by the way. There's no sensible person, I think, in this country, and certainly no politician, that argues for uncontrolled migration. There has to be controlled migration. But my goodness, this country's economic prosperity, as well as the European continent's economic prosperity, relies on migration. How on earth are we going to prosper when this continent needs 45 million workers between now and 2050 if we bring up the drawbridge and don't allow people to come here? upskill them, yes, give them lessons and opportunities to learn English. But this country has required immigration, currently is being propped up by immigration, and needs immigration in the future.
Matthew, how is the country going to deal with what Humza's describing as a working age demographic time bomb?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that every Western nation is facing a demographic crisis. I would completely agree with that. But the way that we're going about trying to solve it is absolute lunacy. Every major study that we've now got on the fiscal effects of migration on Western economies shows that the very kind of mass migration we're pursuing, which is mainly low skill, low wage, poor levels of education from outside of Europe, is a net fiscal cost, not a net fiscal benefit. Even the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK now concedes this point. Even Keir Starmer, in his speech a couple of weeks ago, now concedes this point, that this experiment is not only undermining our prosperity, it is also making things like the housing crisis worse, undermining wages of workers. The workers are people on the left of politics used to care about, but they no longer do, because feeling morally righteous is now more important to the left than actually delivering an economy that works. What we are doing is we are pushing people into a Ponzi scheme. It's a population trap, because what Humza did not mention there is that, guess what? Migrants get old too. They also use the welfare state. They also use public services. So if our answer to the demographic crisis is let's just keep having more migration, and by the way, let's keep having more low-skill migration, that is not the answer. The answer to this problem is a limited amount of genuinely high-skill migration, which is what politicians promised the British people, Labour politicians and Conservative politicians. They didn't deliver that. They lied to the British people. At the same time as we invest in pro-family policies in the UK, and we encourage people from these islands to have more children. That's a twofold response that we need. That's what Israel's been doing. It's what Hungary and Poland have been doing. The evidence so far is a bit mixed. But we need to do what we did with smoking and the environment. We need to fundamentally change the culture in this country, so we are incentivizing people to have more children, and we are supporting British families, not making life harder for them by saying, well, mass immigration is the answer.
Okay.
That is not the answer to this problem.
All right, Humza, how would you respond to those points that Matthew's made?
Well, great to see that Matt's two inspirations are Viktor Orban, an authoritarian figure in Europe, and Israel, of course, the government that's headed by a man that's wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Those are the inspirations that we should be taking. Let's just look at the facts here. We have both an aging population and a declining birth rate. If you do not have migration coming to this country, nobody is going to look after Matt when he's an old man. Nobody's going to look after my children when they are old. And Matt talks about not wanting low-skilled migration. He terms social care as low-skilled. I'll tell you, it's not low-skilled. I've been into many care homes, in fact, in my constituency where I am speaking to you today. So if we don't bring in people to help take care of our elderly, who on earth is going to do it? So absolutely grow our own, where we can create a pipeline of young people to go into professions, whether it's social care, whether it's the NHS, the private sector, yes. But we have a declining birth rate and an aging population. Even if you got every single person in the United Kingdom into work, you're going to have unbelievable amount of shortages, not just in what Matt terms as high-skilled jobs, but also what traditionally has been termed, I think incorrectly, as low-skilled jobs. So people on the right used to claim to be the party of economic prosperity. If we follow their policies, Matt's policies, reforms policies, then this country, this continent, is going to suffer absolute economic collapse. And let me just give you one example. Let's keep sticking to facts where we can. We've seen that one of the outliers when it comes to economic growth in the European continent, in the EU in particular, over the last few years, has been Spain. Spain's economy has grown to by around about 3% GDP per capita 2022 to 2024. The Bank of Spain's own analysis tells us that over 20% of that growth, that contribution comes from immigration. So let me say once again, nobody is suggesting uncontrolled immigration, but we need migration for the prosperity of this country. And the sooner people like Matt and Reform acknowledge that, the better. Otherwise, I'm afraid it is their children, our children, future generations, that will pay the heaviest price for this foolish policy of bringing up the drawbridge.
Humza, I just want to push back on one thing because I know you need to leave us shortly. Matt, I'll give you a chance to respond to what Humza's been saying when we bring on our next guest. But let me ask you this, Humza. If what you're saying is true and if it makes perfect sense, why isn't the current Labor government drilling down on these exact issues? Why instead are they cannibalising rhetoric and slogans from other parties and going down an anti-immigration line? Are they equally to blame for the conversation we're needing to have now?
Well, of course, it's a foolish strategy. They believe that they can try to retain some of their voter base by sounding a bit like Reform, by sounding a bit like Farage, as opposed to coming up with the alternative, and an alternative vision that's rooted, I would suggest, in hope and, of course, of economic prosperity. But my very simple message to the Prime Minister, and frankly to anybody, is that you cannot out-Farage Nigel Farage. You cannot be more extreme in your anti-immigration rhetoric than the very man who's made a living out of it. So it is a foolish political strategy. That's why Labour have been hammered in the polls. We have a election here, a by-election here in Scotland next week. I suspect Labour, in what used to be their heartlands in Scotland, will get an absolute drubbing. Reform have every chance of coming second. My goodness, I certainly hope they don't win the seat up here in Scotland. So, look, I'm not saying that Reform haven't been clever or smart in the way that they have approached their politics. It's populism 101, present very simple solutions to very complex problems, divide society into us versus them. What progressives have failed to do, and I've got to accept, of course, my role in this, what we failed to do is say, well, here's what the alternative actually is. Here's what the hopeful alternative is, not dismissing the concerns that people have, but here's what the alternative is to a much better society where actually we should look at our inclusivity as a strength, not as a weakness, and by the way, very much as a necessity if we want the UK and Europe to economically prosper and not fall off the edge of a cliff.
Matt, I'm going to give you the chance to respond to those points that Humza has made shortly. Stay with us, Matt Goodwin. But Humza Yousaf, I know that we're out of time with you. Thank you so much for joining us here on Counterpoints. Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland and current SNP member in the Scottish Parliament. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, well, as we've lost our time with Humza Yousaf, we have a new guest to bring onto our panel for Counterpoints. John McTernan, political strategist, commentator and former political secretary to then Labor Prime Minister Tony Blair, joins the Counterpoints panel alongside, of course, our guest who has been with us from the top of the show, Matt Goodwin, Professor of Politics, who writes on his Matt Goodwin Substack. John, thanks for joining our panel here on Counterpoints. We had Humza pushing back on some anti-immigration points that Matthew had made. Matt, I said I would give you the right of reply. Even though Humza's not here to hear it, give us your take on what he had to say.
Well, look, let me just make one point in response to what we just heard, which is this assumption on the left that immigration is always good for the economy. Let me just leave viewers with one statistic to consider, okay? Last year, if you look at the latest immigration data in the UK, last year about 766,000 people migrated into the UK from outside of Europe, okay? Now, what percentage of those people came on work visas, came mainly to work? Okay, the answer is 14%, 1-4. And if you look at the recent years, similar figures, somewhere between 14 and 20% came mainly to work. The rest are relatives of workers, students, the relatives of students, asylum seekers, and then we've got the illegal migration crisis, which was interesting hearing Humza say we don't have uncontrolled immigration because we have 160,000 plus people breaking our laws coming into our country. So here's my question for people on the left. If you think immigration is so good for the economy, how on earth can you justify those kinds of figures? Because we don't have a skill-based migration policy. We don't have a migration policy that's driving prosperity. we basically have a Ponzi scheme, lots of low wage, low skill, or in fact, economically inactive migration that is making UK taxpayers worse off. And that's my issue with this. The numbers do not add up.
Okay, before we move on to our next segment, John, I'm going to give you the option of responding to that. What's your take on this anti-immigration rhetoric that we're hearing not just from Reform, but also in part from Labor?
No, Matt is a fluent speaker, but he's tilting at windmills. He's attacking the policies of the previous Tory government. And you know what? They've been buried by the voters, and now they're being buried by their own actions. The Tory party were the dominant party of British politics on the centre-right. They're nowhere now. It was their disastrous attempt to change immigration policies that brought the Boris wave. It's called the Boris wave because Boris Johnson changed migration rules and brought in 1.6 million people. That's not a Labour policy. It would never be a Labour policy. There's a whole set of issues that Matt raised. Then it seems to me it is right when we have vacancies for essential public services in the NHS, nurses or doctors, in social care for care workers. For me, it makes absolute sense not to have vacancies, which then mean long waiting lists, or it means empty beds in care homes, to actually bring in skilled workers to actually to do this. It's a completely different argument. I know from the one that Matthew is doing, he wants to attack the previous Tory government. I'm very happy to do that too. I don't think it throws much light on the real reason for the rise for reform, which in my view is a straightforward fact accounts for it, which is that since the GFC, the global financial crisis, living standards have stagnated in the UK. After 25 years of stagnation, people get angry, and when they get angry, they want change, and they've voted for change repeatedly for the last decade and not been delivered change. And so reform's rise is tied to their name. Their name means change.
I'm absolutely going to get to that, but I just want to ask you both one more question before we get there. This assertion from Nigel Farage that Reform is now the new opposition party. What do you make of that, John? Do you see it now already as a replacement to the Tory Conservatives?
Look, I think, and Matt's much closer to thinking on the centre-right than I am, but I think that there was an assumption that the Tories felt they'd had to deal with reform, but that in the end, by the next election, they could come to a deal on the Tories' terms with reform about trying to create an alliance to take out the Labour Party. I think it's really clear now that whatever deal is done on the right will be done on Nigel Farage's terms. He's established his party as not His Majesty's official opposition, but as the ideological opposition, the ideological alternative to the current government. It gives real difficulties to Farage because on only a handful of MPs, you can't actually have a shadow cabinet that shadows the current cabinet. With that number of MPs, you've got a very small number of staff. You can't do much of the policy development that's required. To propose yourself as the official opposition, you need to be also an alternative government. To be an alternative government, you need to have people understanding, well, that would be my Chancellor, that would be my Home Secretary. I think that's a huge move to make from where they are now. You sort of need to kind of merge, you need to acquire the Tory party and merge with them and then demerge out of them. It takes some talent if this is going to happen. But there's no doubt in my mind that intellectually, ideologically, rhetorically, and in the polls, there is only one party that opposes the Labour Party successfully, and that is Reform.
Matt, what do you make of that? Even though it might have the rhetoric, it might have the ideology, maybe it even has some of the public support, does it just not have the expertise to be an effective opposition and an effective government?
Well, I think as we saw this week with Keir Starmer sprinting up to Northern England to give a speech which exclusively attacked Nigel Farage and Reform and mentioned Nigel Farage no less than 16 times. It's not just the Conservatives that are panicking. The Labour government is clearly aware of what is going to happen in industrial heartlands across Northern England and Wales. As I've been writing for some time, on current polling numbers, Labour will lose more seats to Nigel Farage in Labour areas than they lost to Boris Johnson in 2019. Now, the reason for that, to come back to your question, and where I would perhaps go further than John, is saying this isn't just about voters rejecting the Tories. This is about voters rejecting the political consensus that has governed this country for the last 30 years, that has been pushed on by both the left and the right, which began with Tony Blair, ran through Gordon Brown, David Cameron's coalition government, through to Boris Johnson, and now Keir Starmer. It is a consensus that is united around large-scale mass migration, a London-centric economy that is not willing to leave international conventions to control our borders, and which is basically obsessed with endless amounts of social and economic liberalism, which only about 10 to 15% of the country support. And I think there are lots of people who will be watching this discussion, maybe from outside of Europe, who will be thinking, well, I actually agree with reform that we shouldn't be exposing children to radical gender ideologies and the sexualization of society. I actually agree with them that the first task of a nation is to look after its own people and to be able to control its borders. And these are things that reform are saying, but people on the left or people who oppose reform act as though this is some kind of extremist agenda, but we know it's supported by 70 to 85% of people in this country. That is why Nigel Farage is correcting. He is connecting with those voters. He's saying, I'm not just rejecting the Tories, and I agree with John, the Tories are absolutely finished. He is rejecting the entire consensus in Westminster that has dominated British politics pretty much since 1997.
John, before we move on to our next segment, is there anything you want to respond to that? I can see you madly making notes.
Look, the thing, two responses to that. One is Nigel Farage is going to find the voters do ask the question, does that all add up? And I don't think at the moment that, and understandably, it's a long way from the next election, but Nigel Farage's promises on benefits, promises on tax relief, tax cuts are very expensive, and there's no balancing items that he's proposed to actually show how you can make that add up. But more than that, I disagree with Matt on his diagnosis. I'm certain the voters in Britain since the Brexit referendum, the rise of Corbyn, the landslide for Johnson, the landslide for Starmer, they voted for one thing. They voted for change. The change they want is not about what Matt's described. It's a rejection of neoliberalism. It's a rejection of neoliberal capitalism, the extension of the market into every part of our life. And that thing's been going on since Thatcher in the 70s. And the issue for me is this. Farage understands that. Farage understands people want to move towards some more kind of social democratic state, more protection for workers, more nationalisation, more generous welfare system. I think that's right, but I think the people who can do that properly are actually not reform, because their instincts, in their bones, they actually are more Thatcherite than they are social democrat. That's not their political tradition. It's my political tradition. For me, I am upset to see Farage playing more successfully on nationalisation, workers' rights, welfare benefits than the Labour government are currently doing. And that's what's interesting me. He's not just stealing our voters, he's stealing our clothes.
I'm going to come to that actually with you a little bit later in our program, John, but let's just move on to our next segment, because there is no doubt, as both of you have made very clear, that Britons are still doing it tough. The cost of living crisis hasn't magically gone away just because they've voted for a change in government. And after 14 years of Conservative Party rule, the Labor Party won its huge mandate on that one message, change. But 10 months on, many people are feeling that that change is still a long way off. So, Matthew, let me ask you, how much of what we're seeing is down to reform's individual success, and how much do you think legitimately is just down to Labor's failure?
Well, I think voters are certainly getting a lot of change. It's just not the change that many of them voted for at the general election last year. I mean, don't forget, the Labour Party promised it wouldn't raise taxes, promised it would be fiscally prudent. The Labour Party then came into office, raised taxes, and had a massive injection of spending. When voters were voting for Labour last year, I don't think they were voting for trade deals that would give tax exemptions to Indian workers that weren't available to their British counterparts. I don't think they thought they would be voting for a party that talked loosely about border security and then refused to do anything that is required to control our borders. I don't think they thought they were voting for a Labour government that would actually force UK taxpayers to pay tens of billions of pounds to give away our own territory, the Chagos Islands, to our enemies. And I certainly don't think they thought they'd be voting for a reset with the European Union, which would sell our fishing communities down the river for 12 years and hand jurisdiction to the European Court of Justice in key areas like energy and food. I mean, to be frank, you know, Labour have to look themselves in the mirror. I don't think solving the reform problem is difficult. And this may be where John and I agree. I don't know. I think if I was advising Keir Starmer, which, you know, I don't think I'm going to be on the shortlist of people to get that job. But if I was advising Keir Starmer, I'd just be saying, look, you've got to listen to what reform voters are saying. And this is not complex. They want you to stop the small boats. Right? You scrap the Rwanda plan. We have no offshore processing center. We have no deterrent for illegal migration. You need to fix that tomorrow. If you fix that problem, that will go a long way to countering Nigel Farage. And secondly, you need a credible answer to how we're going to get legal migration down from close to 500,000 every year to a level that most voters want to see. About 85% of voters want it to be below 100,000 a year. I agree with John. Neoliberalism is part of the story. We've gutted out our economy. We've hollowed out the UK economy. I agree with him on all of that. But the dominant issue for reform voters, a priority by far, is mass immigration and the borders. Keir Starmer has to deal with that. If he doesn't deal with that, Nigel Farage will be the next Prime Minister of this country. I'm absolutely confident about that if Labour don't get real about the immigration crisis.
John, what do you have to say to that? Because I note you've written recently a very strong warning saying that you warn that the number one wrong move by Labor would be responding and politically shifting to the right.
Yeah, look, I said earlier that I think Nigel Farage is successfully contesting with Labour by taking Labour policies, taking centre-left policies, social democratic policies. And I think that Labour has been at its best in this government, nationalising the railways, increasing rights for renters, so balancing power between renters and their landlords. I think that's very popular. It's committed to building 1.5 million homes. I think that's a huge contribution to the economy and to communities. And it will be based on extending the amount of social housing, council housing we have in the country, which is desperately needed. There's many areas. My worry about the government at times is it seems embarrassed about the good things it's doing and willing to leave a space. You know, there's a whole extension of workers' rights going on in the bill going through the House of Commons at the moment. But it's Nigel Farage who turns up at demonstrations wearing a union badge, not a Labour minister. So there's a bit, you know, the government need a bit more swagger about what they're doing, and they do need. Look, there's an issue in which I utterly agree with Matt, which is no government will ever be re-elected if it cannot control its country's borders. Security is the fundamental task of a government, whether it is security on the streets, whether it's cyber security, whether it's environmental security or economic security, all areas of security. But the fundamental of this is Keir Starmer has to use his background as a prosecutor to drive hard into how do you crack criminal gangs? You don't do it by stopping the boats. You do it by stopping the gangs, by infiltrating them, having information operations on them, cooperating with European police forces, because these criminal networks they're Europe-wide. They go deep into the Middle East. So you have to do it through a proper police operation. I've got no doubt that has to be done, but it has to be done in parallel with doing those centre-left things, centre-left policies, and delivering on net zero, moving to the green transition, so we get ourselves away from dependence on oil and gas from autocracies.
Right. Matt, I know that we are out of time with you. Is there any last response you want to make towards John before we lose you from our panel?
No, I think we've got some pretty clear dividing lines. For me, as I say, you look at the surveys on reform voters, it really is about this migration question. And Keir Starmer just needs to think about where is this going to go if he doesn't get his arms around that issue. So we're 2025. What is this country going to look like in 2027, 2028, with 50, 60, 70,000 people crossing, crossing the channel in small boats, adding to this mood in the country, which combined with low economic growth is not a good one for our society or our politics. I think things will rapidly start to get a lot worse for Starmer. And just lastly, don't forget, we've got enormous elections next year across Wales, which is a Labour heartland, where Labour, the Industrial Revolution began in many respects in parts of Wales. And I think there's going to be a very profound psychological shock coming to the Labour movement next year, where it will become unavoidable that reform is now not only replacing the Conservatives, but actually much more popular than Labour in its own heartlands. But thank you very much.
John, stay with us. We're going to keep our conversation going with you. But Matthew Goodwin, we will leave it there. I know you need to depart from our panel, so thanks so much for being here on Counterpoints. Matthew Goodwin, a Professor of Politics who writes on his Matt Goodwin Substack. Thank you for your time. John McTernan still joining us here on the Counterpoints panel. Let me ask you this, John. Has the Labor government already waited too long before it changes tact here? Has too much damage already been done?
The UK has very long parliaments. Our parliaments run up to 5 years, which means that the next date for the general election is, the second half, 2029. So we're a long way away from then. And so much can happen. Obviously, global context can change. And put it like this, between now and our election, there'll be another presidential election in the US. Then there'll be a different president from President Trump. There'll be another election in Germany. The face of geopolitics could have changed. The global circumstances could change. And I think that's important to understand. Labour doesn't govern at a moment of its own choosing. It governs at a moment in which there's instability internationally. Some still hang over from the pandemic. Some still a hangover from the high inflation that was caused by the pandemic. Some still a hangover from the high energy prices caused by the ongoing war in Ukraine. So there's a lot of factors that you can't control. One thing you can control, and you should be better at doing, is your communications. Not just what you do, but how you talk about them. And I think that's an area where Labour does need to urgently change.
So they came in on a mandate of change. There was such a desire for something new in the public when they won that landslide victory. Is the issue that they haven't done enough with that mandate? They haven't changed quickly enough? People aren't feeling the response? Or is it that this is just the wrong kind of change? This is not the change people voted for?
Look, I think that is right. I think that they have changed the country, and the good things, as I mentioned when I was discussing it with Matt, like railway nationalisation, like rights for renters, like rights for workers, they're very quiet about those, and raising the national minimum wage, which is now 2/3 of the median wage in the UK. The one thing that everybody knows about the Labour government is they took money away from pensioners, and 10 million people lost their winter fuel allowance in the UK, and pensioners have relatives. So you say 10 million people got 3 or 4 relatives each. You're putting 40 million people offside immediately, and some changes are emblematic. Some changes seem to say who you are, and they're felt, I think, and you get it when you go down political campaigning. There's a feeling of meanness that the Labour government came in. Yes, it was difficult circumstances, but they seemed to be mean from the beginning. And that's not a good way for a government to seem and to act. And, I talked about communications. How you act is probably the most profound way you communicate. So your priority when you come in is not to rebuild schools, not to rebuild the roads, not to rebuild the NHS. Your priority is to take money from pensioners. And that feeling that your actions show who you are, who you care for, that's going to hang over the whole of this government until they do a U-turn on it. And I think they need to do it in a very big way and say, we were wrong, accept we're wrong, and then having done that, be able to move on.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was going to ask, as someone who has been on the inside of 10 Downing Street, I mean, what is the strategy here? Can they reverse it and say, mea culpa, we made change, but this was the wrong change? Do they just need to work on their semantics and try and sell this better? I mean, how do they dig themselves out of this hole?
Look, people like you and me, who in and around politics, thinking about politics, news, current affairs all the time, we make a bigger deal of U-turns, flip-flops, changing your mind in politics. The public kind of go, If you're wrong, stop being wrong, and do the right thing. And I think that's the issue. If you do the right thing, you get a long way with the public, and they go, well, actually, do you know what? That seems actually much more sensible for a Labour government to give money to pensioners, not take it away from them. It feels closer to their core brand value. And so I think you get a lot more forgiveness if you seek it. And I think that's the most difficult thing for politicians. It's really hard for a politician to say sorry, really hard to say, I was wrong.
John, when
Because
is the last time you have ever heard a politician say they were wrong?
Well, my old boss, Des Brown, he was Secretary of State for Defence in the Blair government. He actually went and apologised to the House of Commons for the fact that the Ministry of Defence had allowed some serving members of the Royal Navy to sell a story to a tabloid newspaper. Now, he wasn't responsible personally; he didn't make a decision, but he took responsibility and accountability. He apologised to the House of Commons, and that actually went down well with his colleagues. I think it is actually a thing which, if you do it properly, which means you have to repent and you have to repair. And saying sorry is the bridge between going, look, I got it wrong, and then you do something that makes it better. But you do have to do the other bit. If you say sorry and don't change your actions, then you're not really apologising, are you? You're not changing your behaviour.
You've got to do the hard bit first.
Yes.
Is there anything more demoralising for a Labor voter than seeing the Starmer government be outflanked on the left by Reform UK?
No, to be honest, a Labour government shouldn't have hesitated on coming into power and lifting the two-child benefit cap, which is forcing children into poverty. A Labour government should, though, be proud that Labour values and Labour tradition have set the debate in such a way that it is the radical and the right policy to shift to the left, and so that an avowedly populist centre-right party has had to take on an avowedly left-wing policy. And now it's good that Labour has so defined the territory that Reform have to adopt it. It's sad that Labour didn't do it first.
To your mind, did Keir Starmer squander this historic mandate that he was given?
No, I don't believe so, for two reasons. One is there's still 4 years to run, but the main one is he got a very large majority and he had a manifesto with some very radical mandates in it. The manifesto is committing the Labour government to decarbonising the electricity network. That's a major, major thing to do between now and the next election. It will require a lot of change in investment. It's a big priority to get to net zero. If you look at everything that Labour is focusing on, that's a big dividing line with Reform, because it involves new jobs in renewable energy, new jobs in clean energy, new jobs in the not just power generation, but actually power distribution, the electrical networks. So that's a big area where Labour have chosen a controversial policy, put it in their manifesto, got a mandate for it. On the other side, they've said there'll be planning reforms, that there'll be infrastructure reforms. New infrastructure is often very unpopular in the area it is, whether it is the power grid or whether it is reservoirs that we need for our water supply, whether it's new housing. People want new housing everywhere in the country apart from near them. So the Labour Party has taken policy decisions and put them in a manifesto, got a mandate, and so actually that for me could be the making of this government doing the right thing over a long period, 4 to 5 years, and doing it in a way that may be initially controversial, but by the end, by 28, 29, you'll see actually that's making a difference. And it's when you do the things that make a difference, then you've got a story to sell. You can go back to the country and say, look, we've started on major reform. We said there needs to be a decade of renewal. We're now going to ask you for the second term, which will fill out the second half of this. And I think you could see a very strong communication strategy around that, around really great policy delivery.
That brings me to my last question. Voters seem so fed up with major political parties, not just in the UK, in Australia, in the US. I mean, everyone is looking for some change. And it's not necessarily just the policies that they're looking for, it's the rhetoric, it's the way that they can bring voters into their ideologies. So just finally, what do you think the Labor Party needs to do now to not just get the policies right, but how do they break this feeling of disenfranchisement, this fed-up feeling that people have with major parties? How do they bring people back in?
I'm glad you mentioned Australia there, because the Australian Labor Party, which I've worked for in the past, had a stunning landslide victory in their most recent election. There, the country turned maybe to a new consensus, a new deal, a new settlement, which is a government led by Anthony Albanese, my friend Albo. They actually offered a real break from the kind of neoliberal governance. They've got new ideas on housing, new ideas on cost of living, just a way of I think the way they campaigned in a gentle tone of voice, in a way that met people halfway, that listened to their concerns, gave concessions to them. There's something in that style, and the same's been done in Spain, where Pedro Sanchez has been re-elected. There's very few examples of re-election anywhere in the world in recent years because of cost of living as an issue. And I think maybe learning from Australia is a thing that the UK could do. And it's listening to people, having a measured tone, doing the things they want. And I think most of the times we've discussed, and you discussed with Matt Goodwin, I think with Humza before, a lot of the friction in politics comes from not doing what the voters want. When the voters put you in to do their will, not to do as you wish. And I think that's a lesson from successful progressive governments who have been re-elected around the world. They've actually done a lot of listening and a lot of talking as well, but more in the conversational tone than the lecturing and the speech making.
As a fellow Aussie, I think that's a perfect tone to end on there as we look to Australia for some guidance. Thank you so much for joining us, John McTiernan, former political secretary for then Labor Party Labor Prime Minister Tony Blair. Also joining him on Counterpoints earlier in the program, we had Humza Yousaf, the former Scottish First Minister, and Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics and writer on Substack. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us on Counterpoints. And thank you to our viewers at home for tuning in to Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nusafora. Remember, you can subscribe to Al Arabiya English on YouTube to keep across all our debates and exclusive interviews. And be sure to follow Al Arabiya English on X and TikTok. Thanks for joining us.